What would you do if someone used your own name, your own credentials, your own access codes to destroy you, and there was nothing you could legally prove? Most people would find a quiet way to start over. Simone Aubert didn't get that option. What she got instead was a flooded piece of farmland in rural New Brunswick that nobody wanted, bought with the last money she had in the world. And what was sealed inside it, waiting in the dark for nearly 90 years, was going to change everything. Simone Aubert was 26 years old when her career ended. Not the slow way, not the quiet reassigned and the performance reviews that read between the lines and the growing sense that you're being managed toward the door. Hers ended on a Tuesday morning in November when 2 investigators from CPA Canada walked through the glass doors of Holt & Mercer Financial Group in downtown Toronto and asked to speak with her specifically. She had joined Holt & Mercer straight out of Dalhousie University on the strength of 4 years of working 2 jobs to pay for her own textbooks. Her father ran a small engine repair shop in Riverview, New Brunswick. Her mother worked rotating shifts at the hospital in Moncton. Nobody in her family had ever worked in finance, which meant that every step she had taken toward a career in forensic accounting had been taken without a map. By 24, she was one of the most promising junior associates in the firm. By 25, she was being mentored directly by Lawrence Holt, the founding partner's son, a man who moved through the firm's corridors like he owned the air inside them, which, in every practical sense, he did. What Simone didn't know was that Lawrence had been running a secondary billing scheme for nearly 4 years. Shell invoices, fabricated consulting fees, redirected client funds that passed through holding companies that appeared nowhere on the firm's official filings. It was elegant, methodical, almost invisible. Almost. When a routine external audit flagged the discrepancies, Lawrence needed somewhere for the trail to stop. He needed a name that wasn't his, and Simone's login credentials, which she had shared with him across 8 months of late-night file work. The way junior staff share everything with a senior partner they trust, were sitting right there, ready to be used. By the time she understood what had happened, it was already done. Her access logs showed her authorizing every suspicious transfer, her timestamps, her digital signature on documents she had never seen. Lawrence had been meticulous about it. The investigation took 11 months. The civil lawsuit that followed took another 6. By the time a settlement was finalized, one that required Simone to admit no wrongdoing, but cost the firm nothing. Her CPA designation had been suspended pending review. Her savings account read 0, and every recruiter she'd contacted across the city had gone suddenly, professionally quiet. She drove back to New Brunswick in late March with $3,847 in her account, a Honda Fit with a cracked rear bumper, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 2 years fighting something you shouldn't have had to fight at all. She rented a room from an elderly woman on Lutz Street in Moncton who charged $400 a month and didn't ask questions. She got a cash job washing dishes at a Vietnamese restaurant on Main. She spent the evening staring at a wall and trying not to calculate what she'd lost. It was the restaurant owner who mentioned the municipal auction. He'd seen the notice on a telephone pole outside City Hall. Tax foreclosed properties, mostly rural, mostly unwanted. Simone went on a Wednesday because she had nowhere else to be. The auction was held in a beige room in the municipal services building that smelled like old carpet and toner cartridges. About 30 people sat in plastic chairs. Farmers, a few real estate speculators in matching fleece vests, a couple of retirees who appeared to be there for the entertainment. Simone sat in the back with a Tim Hortons coffee and absolutely no intention of bidding on anything. Lot 18 was a 12-acre parcel outside the village of Bas-Cap-Pelé, roughly 40 minutes southeast of Moncton. The original structure, an Acadian farmhouse built sometime in the early 1900s, had collapsed, leaving only a fieldstone foundation and the ghost of a barn. The low-lying section of the property had been flooded for years. the result of a beaver colony that had dammed the outlet creek and declined to move. The land was zoned agricultural, but currently unusable. No road access beyond a grown-over gravel track. Opening bid, $3,500. A man near the front laughed. Nobody moved. Simone thought about Lawrence Holt at his desk on Bay Street. She thought about the slight tilt of his head at the firm's last Christmas party. The particular look of a man who found her ambition charming the way a cat finds a mouse charming. Her hand went up. She walked out 40 minutes later with a deed to a flooded piece of nowhere, a receipt for $3,847 including administrative fees, and exactly $0 left to her name. The property was at the end of an unmarked gravel track she nearly missed twice. When she got out of the car and stood at the edge of it, the reality arrived all at once and hit her somewhere below the sternum. The floodplain was enormous. A vast grey-brown sheet of standing water stretched across what should have been the lower third of the property, broken only by the tops of dead alders and the rusted tines of an old cultivator that stuck out of the surface like the fingers of a drowning man. The fieldstone foundation of the farmhouse sat on slightly higher ground, but the rear half of it had been reclaimed by the flood as well. Everything smelled like mud and rot, and something underneath that was older and harder to name. Simone sat down on the front lip of the foundation and cried for about 10 minutes, not dramatically, just quietly, the way you cry when you've been holding something in for too long and there's finally no reason not to let it go. You're the one who bought the Bellevaux place. She startled badly, nearly sliding off the stone. Standing at the edge of the gravel track was an older man in a canvas barn coat and rubber boots, caked to the knee in grey clay. He had a face like a topographical map of somewhere cold and was watching her with the patient attention of a man who has spent 50 years watching weather. "Pete Drummond," he said, extending a hand that felt like a work glove that had never been removed. "Got the beef operation up the road. Saw your car." "Simone, I'm the fool who bought it." Pete looked out over the water. Bellevaux farmed this place for 4 generations. Last one, old Gerard, passed in 2019, left it to a nephew in Alberta who couldn't sell it and stopped paying taxes. Beaver Dam took out the culvert on the outlet creek about 6 years back. Province was supposed to deal with it. He spat into the gravel. They didn't. Is there anything under that water worth knowing about? Pete scratched the back of his neck, foundations solid. Fieldstone built to last. He paused. There's an old root cellar somewhere down there, part of the original farmstead. Nobody's seen the entrance in years. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has watched many young people make many poor decisions and has learned to hold his tongue about it. Get yourself proper boots. The ground around the edges is softer than it looks. He walked back up the track without another word. Simone rented a tent and pitched it on the high ground near the foundation. She took extra shifts at the restaurant and spent her mornings at the property's edge, watching the water level, pulling alder saplings, trying not to think too precisely about what came next. The summer that arrived 3 months later was the driest in New Brunswick in recorded history. Environment Canada used words like anomalous and historic, with the careful calm of people who have learned not to sound alarmed about alarming things. The water table beneath the flood plain receded. The surrounding farms drew desperately on what little moisture remained underground, and at Bar Cap Palais, inch by inch, the flood plain began to exhale. By late July, the top of the root cellar's entrance arch had cleared the waterline, old handmade brick, mortared tight, dark with decades of immersion. The arch was intact. By early August, 3 feet of the door itself had emerged. Heavy planked wood, swollen and black, but structurally whole, not rotted the way she would have expected, not rotted at all. Simone stood at the water's edge and stared at it for a long time. The door sat perfectly in its frame, in the way of something that had been sealed deliberately, not abandoned. She needed to know what was inside, but the remaining water between her and the entrance was chest-deep, heavily silted, and not something she could safely navigate alone. She drove to a marine salvage outfit operating out of a converted warehouse near the Petit Kodiak River. The hand-painted sign above the door read Kowalski Recovery. Wade Kowalski was 39, built like a man who had spent 20 years swimming against current and in no way interested in small talk. He had spent a decade with the RCMP's Underwater Recovery Unit before a shoulder reconstruction ended his service career and redirected him toward private salvage. He wiped grease off his hands with a shop rag and studied the photograph on Simone's phone without comment. "Old Acadian root cellar," he said finally. "Pre-Confederation build, possibly. They dug those into hillsides so they'd hold cold year-round. This one looks like it got cut off by grade change at some point, then submerged." He set the photo down. "If there's anything salvageable in there, it's been sealed in static air or sitting underwater for a long time. You're probably looking at deteriorated timber and rusted iron." "Maybe," Simone said, "but the door looks intact." Wade looked at her for a moment. "Day rate for the equipment," he said. 50-50 on anything commercially viable." He brought his truck and a portable pump the following morning. Pete appeared at the edge of the property around 9 o'clock, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee and no explanation, and stayed. It took 4 hours to pump enough water away from the entrance to reach it on foot. By early afternoon, Wade was able to wade through ankle-deep silt to the door and test the frame with a pry bar. "Sealed from the inside," he called back, "not from water damage. Someone planked this shut on purpose. 1930s, maybe, deliberate." What followed took another 40 minutes and a significant amount of effort. But eventually, with a sound like the earth itself exhaling, the door swung inward on its original iron hinges, and Wade clicked on his headlamp and stepped inside. A long silence. "Wade." "I'm here." His voice had changed. "You should come see this." Simone waded through the remaining mud and ducked through the low brick arch. The cellar was long and narrow, dug deep into the original hillside. The air inside was cold and perfectly still, carrying the particular quality of a space that has been closed for a very long time. Wade's headlamp swept across timber shelving, collapsed in places, standing in others, and the shadowed shapes of ceramic crocks, rusted tins, the rotted remnants of burlap. And on the back shelf, sitting in the exact center as though placed there with intention, was a black tin dispatch box. Military style, the size of a shoebox, with a simple latch. The kind used by solicitors in the early 20th century to store documents they needed to keep private and dry. Simone lifted it down. It was heavy. She carried it out into the daylight and set it on the tailgate of Wade's truck. The latch was frozen with rust but gave to a flathead. Inside, wrapped in 3 layers of oilskin and then waxed cotton, was a bundle of documents. The oilskin had held. The paper beneath was yellowed and brittle, but entirely intact. She unfolded the outer pages carefully. Land transfer documents, going back to the late 1920s and the years immediately following the crash of 1929, but not ordinary transfers. These were forced sales. Acadian farm families in Westmoreland County selling properties far below assessed value under circumstances. The attached notations, described carefully and without softening, and attached to each transfer in a neat, careful hand, was a corresponding ledger page showing payments made to a single recipient. The name on every payment record was the same: R.G. Holt, Barrister, Moncton, N.B. Simone stopped breathing. She turned pages. R.G. Holt, Reginald George Holt, a barrister who had served as a commissioner on the Provincial Land Tribunal, using his position to rule on disputed assessments, then steering distressed families toward sales he'd orchestrated himself, collecting fees from both sides. Running this for nearly a decade, documented here in precise, damning detail by someone who had watched it happen and written down everything they saw. She turned to the final pages. A sworn affidavit signed and notarized in 19 owned this farm. Lucien Beliveau, cultivator, Bacap Pelé, N.B. Lucien had documented every interaction with Reginald Holt across 8 years. Names, dates, amounts paid, threats made. He had sealed it all in this box, presumably as insurance. And then, based on the property records she'd already reviewed at the municipal office, lost the farm the following year anyway. But the box had stayed, sealed, waiting. "That's a Holt," Pete said quietly from behind her. He'd walked over without her noticing. "My grandfather used to say that man had his hand in half the failed farms between here and Shediac. Nobody could ever prove it." "Someone tried to," Simone said. She stood very still for a moment, the documents in her hands, the afternoon light coming flat and golden through the pines. She was a forensic accountant. Suspended, but not erased, and she could already see it, the way the money would have moved. How capital extracted from stolen Acadian farmland in the 1930s would have been laundered slowly upward through 3 generations of legal fees, property reinvestment, and professional capital. How it would eventually have become the founding investment of a prestigious Toronto firm. How a man who built his career on that foundation would have every reason to bury any evidence that the foundation itself was rotten. Lawrence Holt hadn't sent her career to its end because she was a threat. He'd sent it to its end because she was getting close to the wrong files. And now she was holding the original source document of everything he was afraid of. She looked at her phone. She had a satellite data plan. She had a solar charging panel she'd wired to a battery bank 3 weeks into camping here, because the rural hydro connection cost money she didn't have. She had 6 weeks of corporate registry analysis built on publicly available data. 6 weeks of evenings with no television, no social life, and nothing to do but work on the one problem she couldn't let go of. She started photographing documents. It took 90 minutes to photograph everything in the box and upload the scans to an encrypted server she had maintained since the investigation began. Because she had learned early and expensively not to trust anything she didn't personally control. She was reviewing the final upload confirmation when Pete said quietly, "Simone." 2 dark SUVs sat at the top of the gravel track, engines off, having arrived without a sound. The men stepping out wore dark clothing chosen for utility. The man walking in front wore a business suit that was wrong for the county road in a way that told her everything about who had sent him. He was perhaps 50, grey at the temples, with the expression of a man who had delivered unfavorable outcomes professionally for a long time and found them unremarkable. He looked at the tinned dispatch box on Wade's tailgate with a brief, controlled attention that confirmed it was precisely what he'd come for. "Mrs. Aubert," he said, "my name is Fletcher Crane. I represent a private client with historical property interests in this region. It's come to our attention that drainage work here may have disturbed legacy documentation belonging to my client's family. We're prepared to offer you $75,000 for the property and any materials recovered from it, effective today. $75,000. 6 months ago, that number would have stopped her heart with relief. Simone looked at the box, then at Fletcher, then at the 2 men behind him who were working very hard at appearing relaxed. "Your client sent you because he's frightened," she said. "Men don't drive 2 hours from the city and show up unannounced when they're not frightened." Something shifted behind Fletcher's eyes. "You're in a complicated legal position," he said, dropping his voice slightly. "Your professional designation is suspended. There's an active civil matter. An offer of this size with a signed release would go a long way toward stabilizing your situation." "My client is Lawrence Holt," Simone said, "Reginald's grandson, who built his family's legal practice on capital that originated in stolen farmland, documented in precise detail in this box, and who spent the last 2 years framing me for his own fraud because I got too close to the wrong files." She held the box against her side. "I finished uploading everything 11 minutes ago. The scans, plus 6 weeks of corporate registry analysis, are sitting on an encrypted server tied to a 96-hour dead man's protocol. Every 96 hours, I enter a refresh key. If I don't, or if something happens to me, the full package goes automatically to the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit, the Law Society of Ontario, Revenue Canada, and the CBC Investigative Desk. She paused. I'm a forensic accountant, Fletcher. Information security is my profession. The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone recalculating from the beginning. From the tree line at the edge of the property came a sound, deliberate and unmistakable. Pete Drummond stepped out with his 12-gauge, held in the easy, unhurried way of a man who has done this before, positioned at an angle that covered all three arrivals, without appearing to aim at anyone specifically. I know you, Pete said to Fletcher conversationally. You acted for Tri-County Aggregates when they tried to put a gravel operation in on the Marsh Road in 2018. County Council turned them down. That was my cousin's land they were trying to access. He paused. You want to talk to me about fair offers? Go ahead. Fletcher looked at Pete, then at Wade, who had moved to a position beside the truck and was holding a pipe wrench with a technical neutrality that didn't require elaboration. Then back at Simone. Call Lawrence, Simone said. Put him on speaker. I want to speak with him directly. Fletcher held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached inside his jacket, dialed and held the phone out. The line rang twice. Is it handled? Lawrence Holt's voice was exactly as she remembered it, smooth, compressed, carrying the small impatience of a man who expected problems to be solved before they reached him. Hello, Lawrence. The silence that followed was total. Simone, the smoothness was gone entirely. How did you? I'm holding Reginald's ledger, she said. The one he sealed in Lucien Beliveau's root cellar in 1938. I have the originals and I have high-resolution scans of everything uploaded to a server you cannot access. I also have 6 weeks of corporate registry analysis, tracing the money your grandfather extracted from 18 Acadian farming families directly into the investment accounts that capitalized your father's initial practice, and from there into the founding capital of Holt and Mercer. She kept her voice very steady. You've known this existed. You've had someone watching this property since the water started dropping. That's how you knew to send Fletcher. Silence, longer this time. What do you want? Lawrence said. The assurance was completely gone. What remained sounded like something that had just run out of room. I want my CPA designation reinstated, full and unconditional. I want the civil action withdrawn with prejudice and a public statement from the firm acknowledging that the transactions in question were not carried out by me. I want my employment file corrected. She paused. I also want a letter of reference, a real one. You can't. I can also send everything I have to the RCMP tonight, Simone said. The choice is yours, but I'd like an answer before Pete's arm gets tired. She heard him breathing, the sound of a man searching for an exit that isn't there. Send me the paperwork, Lawrence said finally. The words came out barely above a whisper. I'll have legal process it. By Friday, Simone said, and Lawrence, if a single document comes back incorrectly drafted, the server refreshes without my key, and you can explain Reginald's ledger to the Law Society yourself. She ended the call. The two men in dark clothing got back in the SUVs without being asked. Fletcher paused at the vehicle door and looked at Simone for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, somewhere between professional acknowledgement and personal displeasure, and then got in and drove away down the gravel track without another word. Simone sat down on the tailgate. Her legs had decided they were done for the moment. Pete came and leaned against the truck beside her, shotgun at his side, and looked out over the water where the late afternoon light was moving across the surface. Wade made 3 cups of instant coffee on his camp stove without commenting on anything that had happened, which was exactly the right response. You going to be all right, Pete, after a while? Yeah, Simone said, I think I am. The paperwork arrived on Thursday. Her designation review was completed by mid-October. The civil action was formally withdrawn in November, with a statement from Holton Mercer that she kept framed in her office for years. Simone did not leave Barcap Palais. She and Wade drained the flood plain properly the following spring, a permitted project that involved relocating the beaver colony to a protected wetland 3 kilometers east, installing a regulated culvert on the outlet creek, and bringing in a wetlands ecologist from the University of New Brunswick who spent 2 summers cataloguing what came back and called it, in an academic paper Simone framed for the kitchen wall, one of the most ecologically significant small-scale restoration projects in the maritime provinces in a decade. The tin dispatch box and its contents went to the Centre d'études acadiennes at the Université de Moncton, where researchers spent 3 years using Lucien Beliveau's documentation to identify the descendants of every family named in Reginald Holt's ledger. A remediation fund was established, modest but real, with contributions from Holton Mercers as part of a broader settlement that Lawrence negotiated quietly to stay out of a courtroom. It was, in the end, the most honest thing the Holt name had ever been attached to. Lawrence left the firm the following year. He did not comment publicly. Pete came for coffee every Sunday. Wade built a small workshop on the back corner of the property and ran his salvage operation from it. Simone rebuilt her forensic accounting practice slowly, carefully, taking only cases she believed in. She paid for the farmhouse roof in the 2nd year, the kitchen in the 3rd. On the morning they poured the concrete for the new barn foundation, staked on the same footprint as Lucien Beliveau's original, which felt right in a way she didn't need to say out loud. Simone stood at the edge of the field that was no longer flooded and looked out at the clean, open water of the restored wetland. A pair of great blue herons stood in the shallows, entirely unbothered. She had come here with nothing but the last of her money, and a decision she'd made before she had time to think herself out of it. And she had found, sitting in the dark at the bottom of a sealed room, exactly what she needed. Not because luck had turned in her direction, but because a man named Lucien Beliveau had trusted, decades before she was born, that if you document the truth carefully enough and seal it somewhere safe, it will eventually surface. So here's what I want to know. If you had been sitting in the back of that auction room with $3,847 and nothing left to lose, would you have raised your hand? Drop your answer in the comments below, and if some stories stayed with you, share it with someone who could use a reminder that rock bottom has a flaw. Like the video, subscribe to claim the drama, and we'll see you in the next one.